Have you ever created something truly beautiful? Like you poured your absolute focus into every single pixel and interaction state.
Oh, absolutely. The kind of project where you just obsess over every tiny detail.
Right, exactly. And then you hand the files off to a development team and you just watch as it gets completely, fundamentally ruined in the execution.
It is honestly a universally agonizing experience in this industry.
Yeah. You pull up the staging link and what was supposed to be a seamless, elegant experience looks like, well, a digital ransom note.
Right. It's that exact moment where your perfectly calibrated design system collides with the deeply imperfect reality of development.
It's just so frustrating. It's the realization that having a bulletproof design system is like only about 10% of the battle.
Exactly. The translation of that design into a shipped product, that is where the entire vision usually just falls apart.
That specific frustration, like watching your work get, as our material today describes it, butchered, is the origin story of what we are going to explore today.
It really is the perfect starting point for this deep dive.
So today we are diving into the introductory chapter of a highly practical book. It's called Designing User Interfaces by Micah and Diana.
Which I have to say is just an incredibly pragmatic piece of work.
It really is. And before we get into the mechanics of how the authors solved this whole handoff nightmare, I have a quick piece of housekeeping.
Always important to get that out of the way.
Right. If you find this kind of breakdown useful for your own workflow, make sure to hit follow on the channel. We do this a lot.
And you definitely don't want to miss future discussions.
Exactly. And if you want to grab the book we are analyzing today, the link is right down in the description, or you can just scan the QR code currently on your screen. You will likely want to have this one on your desk.
Because what we are analyzing here is not, your standard self-congratulatory textbook introduction.
No, not at all. It feels completely different.
It is essentially a postmortem on decades of industry failure, and it's followed by a roadmap for a completely different way of running a digital product team.
So let's start where the methodology actually started. The setting is a classroom back in December of 2018.
Right, so Maurice and Diana were teaching UI design classes at the time.
Yeah, and they were practitioners first, right? They were just stepping into this educational role.
Exactly. And as a crutch, after every class, they would send their students these loose PDF materials.
Like just functional cheat sheets to summarize what they just talked about during the lecture.
Yeah, pretty much. It was an ad hoc fix. When you are a working professional trying to teach on the side, you don't necessarily have a highly curated curriculum ready to go.
You just kind of dump your working knowledge into a document and send it out.
Right. You make a PDF on typography one week and a PDF on color theory the next week.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's like handing someone puzzle pieces one by one after every class.
That is a great way to look at it.
Right. Eventually, the students realize they just have a pile of cardboard, and they want to see the picture on the front of the box. They need that overarching framework.
And that is exactly what happened. The students eventually started asking, where is the book that contains all of these PDFs?
But there was no book, right?
No, not at all. It was literally just a scattered pile of digital handouts.
Wow. So they were basically forced to pivot by their own students.
Yeah, that request speaks directly to how human beings process complex, multidisciplinary systems. It's fascinating from a psychological standpoint.
How so? I mean, what is happening in the student's brain there?
Well, when you are learning user interface design, you aren't just learning how to use a software tool like Figma or Sketch.
Right, it's way more complicated than just learning the interface of the software.
Exactly. You are learning cognitive psychology, visual hierarchy, grid mathematics, and interaction logic.
That is a lot to juggle at once.
It is. And our brains inherently require an architectural structure to map all those discrete concepts onto.
So the loose PDFs were actually making it harder to learn.
In a way, yes. Loose PDFs carry a massive cognitive load. The student is basically forced to invent the connective tissue themselves.
Oh, I see. They have to figure out how the typography PDF from week 2 integrates with the accessibility PDF from week 6.
Right. When they asked for the book, they were really asking for an anchor.
They wanted the narrative structure that dictates how all these micro decisions interact in a holistic ecosystem.
Exactly. And compiling those notes forces the authors into a completely different mental space, too.
I would imagine so. It's one thing to teach a discrete lesson on button states, right?
Yeah, and it's another thing entirely to map out how those button states influence an entire product's conversion funnel.
Think about your own workflows for a second, out there listening. How much of your operational knowledge is scattered across loose notes or Notion pages or Slack threads?
Probably way more than most people would like to admit.
Right. And all those unwritten rules just floating around in your head, the act of gathering that into a centralized manual really forces you to identify the gaps in your own logic.
It forces synthesis. The authors moved from being reactive instructors, just answering the immediate needs of the class, to being proactive architects.
They were building a comprehensive methodology.
Yes. They realized the students weren't just asking for a physical compilation, they were highlighting a massive void in the industry's educational framework.
Which brings us to the obvious question here. If you're teaching a class and your students want a book, why not just point them to the established literature?
That would be the easy route, wouldn't it?
Right. Go to Amazon, find the definitive text on UI design, and just assign it to the class.
But they actually surveyed the existing literature and essentially deemed it useless.
Yeah. They describe the current state of UI books as, and I quote, out of date, short, vague, and often contradictory.
Which is a pretty brutal assessment of your own industry's educational materials.
It really is. Now, I want to unpack this because on the surface, calling foundational literature contradictory feels like a bit of a stretch.
It does sound harsh at first.
I mean, we all know design systems fragment and trends clash. We all remember the painful transition from skeuomorphism to flat design.
Oh, yes. That was a rough couple of years for everyone.
But how does a textbook on the fundamentals end up actively contradicting itself?
It happens because design rules are aggressively context-dependent.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, most academic literature fails to establish that context. Imagine a book where Chapter 2 focuses on designing data-heavy enterprise software.
Like a Bloomberg terminal or something.
Exactly. The rule there is high density. You minimize white space to maximize information velocity. The user needs to see everything at once.
Right, that makes total sense for a stock trader.
But then Chapter 5 in that same book discusses consumer-facing onboarding flows.
Let me guess. The rule there is low density.
You got it. Maximize white space to reduce cognitive friction. Keep it simple and clean.
So if the author doesn't explicitly explain the underlying why behind those rules, it just looks like they are changing their mind.
Precisely. If they don't delineate the fact that a stock trader has a completely different cognitive state than a casual mobile game player, the junior designer is lost.
They just read two completely opposing rules in the exact same book.
The text contradicts itself because it presents contextual tactics as universal laws.
Oh, wow. That context collapse must leave a beginner totally paralyzed.
It absolutely does. You try to apply the high-density rule to a consumer app, and it looks like a complicated spreadsheet.
And if you apply the low-density rule to an enterprise dashboard, the users mutiny because they have to scroll 4 times just to see their daily data.
Exactly. And that is just the contradictory critique. What about the claim that these books are out of date?
Right. Because using, say, 2014 design rules for a 2018 smartphone ecosystem is like trying to navigate a modern highway system using a map from 1950.
That is a perfect analogy. The destinations might be the same, but the infrastructure has completely shifted.
The velocity of change in digital product design is just ruthless, isn't it?
It really is. And traditional publishing is glacial by comparison.
Yeah, how long does it even take to get a textbook published?
A traditional publishing house takes about 2 years to commission, edit, print, and distribute a textbook.
Wow, 2 years. In tech, that is an absolute eternity.
In that 2-year window, the entire paradigm can shift. We went from fixed-width desktop layouts to responsive grids to mobile-first environments, all in a relatively compressed timeline.
And then to gesture-based navigation.
Exactly. If a book is teaching you how to optimize hover states for a computer mouse, and the entire market has shifted to thumb swipes on glass, that book isn't just slightly behind.
It is actively teaching a mental model that no longer exists in reality.
So the student is spending money and time mastering the anatomy of a dead language, basically.
That is so frustrating for a beginner. And then we have the critique that these books are short and vague.
This is the one that really resonates with a lot of working professionals, I think.
Yeah, because we see it constantly in thought leadership. You read an article by a massive, respected agency, and the advice is just ethereal.
Make the design breathe, right?
Yes. Ensure the visual hierarchy feels right. If I am a junior designer, make it breathe means absolutely nothing to me.
You are identifying what psychologists call the curse of knowledge.
The curse of knowledge.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon where an expert fundamentally loses the ability to remember what it is like to not know something.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
When you have designed 1,000 interfaces, your brain chunks the information. You don't consciously calculate the mathematical ratio between the header text and the body text anymore.
You just intuitively know when it looks right.
Right. Your brain completely bypasses the discrete mechanical steps.
But when a publisher asks you to write a book, you have to reverse engineer that intuition into actionable instructions.
And most experts fail miserably at this. Instead of providing the precise mathematical baseline grids, they default to vague platitudes.
Because they literally cannot access the granular steps anymore. The scaffolding they use to build their expertise is just dissolved into pure instinct.
Precisely. They offer aesthetic philosophy when the beginner desperately needs mechanical physics.
And this leaves beginners constantly battling imposter syndrome, doesn't it?
Oh, constantly. The novice reads a vague text, tries to apply it, fails, and assumes they lack some innate creative genius.
They don't realize the educational material itself is functionally broken.
They think it's their fault.
So the authors, Mikunda and Diana, see this landscape of vague, outdated, contradictory material, and they decide to build their own foundation.
And the bedrock they are building on is immense. It really is.
Yeah, they state that the methodology in this book is derived from over 500 completed design projects.
Shipped over the last 10 years alone.
And on top of that, they have been designing digital products since 1999.
The sheer density of that output fundamentally changes the nature of the knowledge they're sharing.
Let's actually do the math on that for a second. 500 projects over 10 years is roughly 50 projects a year.
That is one completed, shipped design project every single week for a decade.
That is just insane. That is not theoretical exploration. That is an industrial-scale crucible of trial and error.
When you are shipping at that velocity, you really don't have the luxury of sitting around debating aesthetic theory.
Right. Your work is constantly colliding with reality.
There is a massive chasm between what we call academic design and battle-tested design.
Explain the difference there. What does academic design look like?
In an academic or purely portfolio-driven environment, like posting hypothetical redesigns on Dribbble or Behance, you are operating in a vacuum.
Oh, I see. You control all the variables.
Exactly. You can design an elegant, minimalist interface because you don't have to account for weird edge cases.
Or localization, right. Like when German text is so long, it completely breaks your carefully balanced layout.
Or a client who insists on putting a massive, ugly promotional banner right in the middle of your perfectly balanced grid.
Or just the reality of user behavior.
Yeah.
You design what you think is a highly intuitive navigation structure, and then you watch the heat maps.
And you realize the users are completely ignoring it and trying to click on a static image instead.
Yeah, exactly. The users never do what you expect them to do.
So when you ship 500 projects into the real market, the market violently corrects your assumptions.
You are essentially running continuous high-stakes A/B tests on human psychology.
You quickly strip away anything that is just trendy and isolate what actually drives conversion and usability.
And that 1999 start date provides an incredibly rare meta-perspective, too.
It really does. 1999 is ancient history in tech terms.
You're talking about designing for CRT monitors with the resolution of, like, a microwave screen.
And dial-up internet constraints where every single kilobyte of an image had to be heavily justified.
Right. So surviving from 1999 to the present means they navigated the dot-com bubble.
And the transition from clunky table-based HTML layouts to CSS.
The whole Web 2.0 era with the glossy buttons.
Yeah, and then the launch of the iPhone, which completely decimated traditional web design overnight.
And finally, the rise of responsive, component-based design systems.
When you have lived through the birth and death of that many paradigms, you stop anchoring your expertise to the specific tool or the current trend.
You realize that a drop shadow is just a trend, but the human psychological need to understand depth and priority on a screen is immutable.
Exactly. They're writing a book based on the immutable psychology, not the fleeting tool sets.
Which makes their approach to publishing this book deeply surprising to me.
How so?
Well, you have two practitioners with decades of survival in the trenches, right? 500 shipped projects, a battle-tested framework.
Yeah.
Typically, when someone reaches that level of authority, they adopt a very dogmatic stance.
They present their methodology as the definitive, unquestionable law of the discipline.
Right. You pay for their textbook, and you just accept their gospel. But they take the exact opposite route here.
They do. They explicitly state in the intro, we don't assume that what we say here is the only right way to do things, it's the way we do it.
And they actively treat the book like an open source software project.
Which is such a unique concept for a printed medium.
They solicit feedback, suggestions, and corrections from the readers, and they actually add those contributors to the back of the book.
It is a masterclass in intellectual humility, and honestly, it is the only logically sound way to approach a discipline that evolves this rapidly.
It feels risky, though. If I am buying an expert's manual, part of me wants the comfort of absolute certainty.
I can understand that.
Admitting that your way is just a way and inviting the audience to correct you could be seen as undermining your own authority.
It only undermines authority if your authority is built on ego.
Oh, that's a great point.
If your authority is built on empirical results, it actually reinforces your credibility. Dogmatism is the death of innovation in technical fields.
Because the moment you say this is the one true way, you stop looking for better ways.
The moment a senior designer or engineer declares, this is the one true way to build this, they have blinded themselves to the inevitable technological shift that will render their method obsolete.
By treating a static medium, like a published book, as a dynamic open source repository, they are aligning the format of the education with the reality of the industry.
They are essentially saying, here is the map we drew to survive the last 500 expeditions. It works, but the terrain is constantly shifting.
So if you find a more efficient route, patch the map so we all benefit.
Exactly. And psychologically, this destroys the artificial barrier between the expert and the student.
The reader is no longer just a passive vessel waiting to be filled with knowledge.
Right. They are recruited as a collaborator. It transforms a monologue into a continuous feedback loop.
It requires immense confidence to stand in front of your peers and say, this is our best current understanding, but we reserve the right to get smarter tomorrow based on your input.
Think about how that applies to how you communicate your own expertise in the workplace.
Yeah, like when you are onboarding a new team member or presenting a strategy to a stakeholder, do you present your framework as an inflexible mandate?
Or do you present it as the current optimal baseline, actively insisting stress tests?
Building a culture where the methodology is open to iterative improvement is how you prevent institutional rot.
It is the difference between a fragile system that shatters under pressure and an anti-fragile system that gets stronger when exposed to new data.
Now, this highly pragmatic, ego-free approach didn't just manifest out of thin air, did it?
No, not at all. It was forged as a defense mechanism against a very specific type of professional pain.
To understand why they operate this way, we have to look at the structural history of their company, HYPE4.
This is where the philosophical theories of design hit the brutal mechanics of agency execution.
When they co-founded HYPE4 back in 2013, it was a tiny, design-only studio, literally just 3 people.
And they operated on the standard industry model of the time.
Right. The client hires the design agency to create the blueprints and the visual assets.
And then the client takes those assets to a completely separate software development agency to write the actual code.
But they quickly hit a wall that was just destroying their morale.
The execution from these external developers was consistently abysmal.
Their intricate, carefully considered designs were being, in their own words, butchered beyond recognition.
Butchered is exactly the right word for the silo problem. It captures the visceral reaction a designer has when they see their intent stripped of all nuance.
We've all seen this happen. It's like writing a beautiful, complex symphony, handing the sheet music to a band, and they play it back to you on kazoos.
That is exactly what it feels like.
You design a custom interface where the animations serve a specific cognitive purpose, right? Maybe smoothly guiding the user's eye from a data point to a call to action.
You hand the files off. A month later, the staging site goes live, and the animation is just gone.
Replaced by a jarring instant page load. The custom typography that established the brand trust has been swapped out for a default system font.
Just because it was slightly easier to implement.
The margins are completely collapsed, making the data unreadable. And the developer looks at it and says, what? The button is there, the data loads. Functionally, it works.
This is the catastrophic failure of throwing it over the wall.
Break that down for me. Why does throwing it over the wall always fail?
Because when you have 2 separate entities with 0 cross-functional alignment, their incentive structures are completely opposed.
Okay, what is the design agency optimizing for?
The design agency is optimizing for user experience, aesthetic fidelity, and psychological flow.
They are rarely considering the technical debt. or the server rendering times, right?
Exactly. Or the sheer complexity of the database queries required to populate their beautiful, intricate charts.
So they are designing in a frictionless vacuum.
Right. Then they throw those files over the wall to the development team. And the development team is optimizing for something totally different.
Velocity, code stability, and minimizing bugs.
Yes. When a developer encounters a highly custom, complex design element that will take 12 hours to code and might introduce cross-browser bugs,
And they have a deadline breathing down their neck.
they will take the shortcut every time. They will use a pre-built standard component that takes 5 minutes to implement.
Because they don't share the designer's vocabulary or value system.
To them, the aesthetic nuance is just arbitrary. The function is the only metric of success. They don't perceive the shortcut as butchering the product.
The designer views the file as a strict architectural blueprint, but the developer views the file as a loose aesthetic suggestion.
And that misalignment is where the product dies.
So you have HYPE4, and they are tired of seeing their blueprints turned into, strip malls.
And you can't really control an external agency.
No. So they decided to build their own engineering branch.
But they didn't just hire a bunch of developers, put them in a different room, and recreate the exact same silo internally.
Right, that would defeat the whole purpose.
Yeah.
They instituted a rigid operational philosophy, a design-driven approach where the disciplines are literally forced to overlap.
This is how you operationalize empathy.
Their core rule was mandatory cross-training. All developers at HYPE4 had to understand design principles, and all designers had to know the basics of how to code.
It completely changed the dynamic.
I really want to drill down into the mechanics of this. We hear a lot of buzz about hybrid teams, but how does forcing a designer to learn CSS actually change the trajectory of a complex project?
It grounds them in the reality of their medium.
Doesn't it just distract them from their core competency, though? Being creative?
Not at all. Let's look at the designer first. If a visual designer doesn't understand the absolute basics of how the CSS box model works,
Or how Flexbox and CSS Grid calculate spacing.
right. If they don't know that, they will design layouts that are literally impossible to build efficiently.
They will arbitrarily position elements on a canvas without understanding the mathematical relationship required to make that layout respond to a mobile screen.
They are designing a static painting, not a dynamic system.
Ah, I see.
And when the developer gets that painting, they have to write massive amounts of custom, fragile code just to force the browser to render it.
But when the designer learns the constraints of the code, what happens?
Their ego is removed from the equation. They stop designing impossible magic and start designing elegant solutions within the mechanical reality of the browser.
They anticipate the technical breakpoints before they even happen.
Yes. They organize their files in a way that maps directly to how the developer will eventually structure the code.
So the handoff becomes frictionless because the designer has already solved the baseline technical problems.
Exactly. And what happens on the flip side?
Yeah, how do you train a back-end engineer to care about kerning or visual weight?
You don't necessarily train them to execute it perfectly from scratch, but you train them to see it.
You teach developers why typography hierarchy matters for user comprehension.
You explain the cognitive function of white space. You teach them that it isn't just empty space, but a structural tool to group related information.
So when a developer understands the purpose behind the aesthetic choices, they stop viewing those choices as just like arbitrary annoyances.
They develop a genuine respect for the intent. So when they are writing the front-end code and the spacing looks a little tight, their own trained eye catches it.
They don't take the lazy shortcut that ruins the visual balance because they understand that compromising the visual balance compromises the product's usability.
They become the final guardians of the design rather than adversaries.
The wall is entirely dismantled. The designer knows what the developer needs to build efficiently, and the developer respects the cognitive logic behind what the designer created.
And this completely eradicated the execution failure for HYPE4.
The precision of their front-end development became their main competitive advantage, didn't it?
It did. Clients realized that the prototype they approved would be exactly what actually shipped to the App Store. No compromises.
Empathy in this context isn't just a soft skill. It is a hard operational optimization tool.
It completely eliminates the friction of translation.
This is a massive takeaway for anyone listening, regardless of your industry.
Absolutely, it applies to almost any cross-functional team.
If you find yourself constantly frustrated because your ideas are being poorly executed by another department,
Like if the sales team is butchering your marketing messaging, or the contractors are ignoring your architectural specs?
The problem is likely a lack of a shared vocabulary. You're
Well,
throwing things over the wall.
if you take the time to learn the constraints of the people executing your ideas, and you teach them the underlying logic of your vision, the quality of the output will skyrocket.
And when a strong, empathetic foundation like that is established, the team becomes incredibly adaptable,
They aren't bogged down in internal friction anymore.
which allows them to scale their cognitive bandwidth across a wildly diverse set of challenges.
And the breadth of what HYPE4 tackles is just staggering.
It really is. They build web and mobile products for everyone from scrappy startups to global Fortune 500 companies.
But what is truly fascinating is the sheer variety of the industries they operate in.
Yeah, they list their project categories and includes banking, finance, advertising, media, and pregnancy tracking.
Switching from designing high-security global banking infrastructure to designing a pregnancy tracker is extreme whiplash.
From Fortune 500 banking to pregnancy tracking. Talk about whiplash. Most agencies niche down, right?
Yeah, they become the fintech guys or the healthcare guys.
How does a single team maintain deep expertise while constantly context switching across completely unrelated domains?
That context switching is precisely what generates their deep expertise.
Really? I would think it would spread them too thin.
Niching down makes business sense for an agency's marketing, but it often leads to deep intellectual stagnation.
Because you just do the same thing over and over.
Exactly. When an agency only designs banking apps for 5 years, they stop solving problems and start recycling templates. They just move the same data tables around.
But a domain-agnostic agency experiences constant, aggressive cross-pollination.
Let's break down the mechanics of that cross-pollination. How does the architecture of a banking app directly improve the design of a pregnancy app?
It comes down to identifying the underlying structural challenges, right?
Yes. A heavy fintech application requires incredibly dense data visualization.
You have to take complex, multivariable data sets, like a user's spending habits, investment growth, loan amortizations over a 12-month period, and render that into a chart.
A chart that has to fit on a 6-inch mobile screen without overwhelming the user.
The constraints are brutal. The security protocols dictate strict user flows, and the tone must be intensely trustworthy.
So the team spends 6 months solving the raw mathematics and code logic of rendering that data smoothly.
Okay, so the technical infrastructure for charting is now battle-tested.
Right. Now their next project is a pregnancy tracking app. The aesthetic requirement is completely different.
It needs to be empathetic, warm, calming.
But beneath that aesthetic, a pregnancy app is fundamentally a data visualization tool.
Oh, I see. The user is inputting sensitive biometric data, charting fetal growth percentiles over a 9-month period, and tracking medical milestones.
The math and the code logic required to render a growth chart are structurally identical to the logic required to render an investment portfolio chart.
Oh, that is brilliant. The underlying skeleton is exactly the same.
Exactly. Because they just solved the problem of secure data entry and complex charting in the hyper-rigid banking environment, they can take that robust architecture and apply it to the pregnancy app.
They just wrap the rigorous mechanics of finance in the warm aesthetic needed for expectant mothers.
They don't have to reinvent the wheel, they just have to change the tires.
And it flows in the opposite direction too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The intense focus on emotional resonance and human-centric micro-interactions required for the pregnancy app will inevitably influence their next corporate project.
They might bring a warmer, more intuitive onboarding flow to an otherwise sterile enterprise software tool.
Bouncing between rigid constraints and emotional design keeps their mental models incredibly agile.
It totally prevents them from defaulting to industry tropes. And speaking of keeping their mental models agile, there was one final operational detail they mentioned that I think is the actual secret to their longevity.
What's that?
Well, after cranking out 500 projects, dealing with massive corporate clients, and solving intense structural problems, you would think they would just want to disconnect at the end of the day.
You'd think they'd be exhausted.
Right. But they explicitly note that after hours, they work on their own internal startups.
And they emphasize that they do it purely to have a lot of fun.
That inclusion of the word fun isn't just a throwaway line, is it?
No, it is a critical component of preventing systemic burnout in a high-output creative environment.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does adding more work to your plate after a long day of client work actually prevent burnout?
Because client work, no matter how prestigious or well-paid, is fundamentally an exercise in compromise.
Yeah, that's true. When you are designing for a Fortune 500 company, the client always holds the final veto power.
There are brand guidelines that cannot be violated, legacy code bases that limit your interactions, and layers of middle management that will inevitably water down your most innovative ideas.
Over a decade, that continuous process of compromise can really erode a designer's passion.
You start feeling like a pixel pusher executing someone else's safe decisions.
You completely lose the agency over your own craft.
Exactly. But an internal after-hours startup, that is a sandbox with zero external constraints.
There is no client to tell you no.
There is no legacy brand guideline. They can experiment with radical new tech stacks, bizarre navigation models, or aggressive color palettes that a bank would never approve.
It is pure, unadulterated creative play.
It reminds them of why they fell in love with the discipline of building digital products in the first place.
It's the ultimate palette cleanser. And I imagine that unconstrained play actually feeds back into the commercial work too.
Oh, definitely. The wild experimental animation they figured out for their fun side project eventually gets refined and integrated into a client pitch 6 months later.
So play is basically the research and development department for their commercial agency.
It keeps their skills on the absolute bleeding edge without risking any client capital.
It has been an incredible journey to trace today. We started with the simple, functional need of students asking for a single source of truth instead of a pile of loose PDFs.
And that simple request exposed the massive cognitive gap in how we teach and learn complex systems.
We examined the failure of traditional literature too, how books become outdated the moment they are printed.
And how experts suffer from the curse of knowledge, providing vague philosophy when beginners desperately need mechanical instruction.
We looked at the sheer volume of reps required to build true expertise. 500 projects shipped in 10 years.
Surviving the technological whiplash from 1999 to the present.
All of which culminated in the decision to treat their book as an ego-free, open-source collaboration rather than a static decree.
And we dug into the literal mechanics of the silo problem.
We saw how throwing designs over the wall leads to butchered execution, and how HYPE4 solved this by forcing crass functional empathy.
Making designers understand code constraints and developers understand visual hierarchy.
Finally, we explored how that empathetic foundation enables them to seamlessly apply the rigorous architecture of banking to the emotional design of pregnancy tracking.
All while protecting their creative spark through unconstrained after-hours play.
It is a brilliant blueprint for not just writing a book, but running an entire discipline.
It really is.
Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with today. The authors note that their primary motivation for distilling these 2 decades of experience into this methodology is so you don't have to repeat their painful mistakes.
They suffered the butchered designs and the client friction so you can take the shortcut.
Right. But if you invert that logic, it raises a fascinating question about your own current struggles. If our worst professional failures, our biggest miscommunications, and our most painful process bottlenecks are ultimately just raw data points destined for someone else's optimized manual.
What massive mistake are you currently making that might end up being the crucial lesson that teaches someone else how to succeed tomorrow?
Are you currently suffering through the raw material of your own methodology without even realizing it?
It completely reframes how you look at a bad day at the office.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As a final reminder, if you want to keep unpacking these kinds of operational and philosophical frameworks, hit the follow button on the channel.
And if you are ready to stop relying on outdated, vague design rules, you absolutely need to check out Micah and Diana's book, Designing User Interfaces.
The link is right down in the description, or you can grab it instantly by scanning the QR code on your screen right now. Until next time, keep optimizing your systems. Keep learning the language of the people executing your ideas.
And whatever you do, don't let them play your carefully crafted symphony on a kazoo.